So it works. Okay.
Yeah, just the pointer.
Yeah, the pointer. So this is the pointer. If I want to use the pointer, then this is the pointer. Yeah, because the electronic pointer appears here, but not there. So yeah, it's okay. Huh?
Yeah. It's okay.
It's okay. I mean, I don't know.
Okay, let's go back to the...
Yes. That's okay. Yeah.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Ignacio Pagonabarraga from University of Barcelona. He will talk about defects, turbulence, and interfaces active.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm not a mathematician. I'm a physicist. You will notice this because I'm not using PDF. I have this keynote that was part of the problem. And I will not show any rigorous mathematical result. I hope you bear with me. I will go through what is essentially a physical understanding, maybe for you it's more a phenomenology of what happens in active fluids and what is peculiar about these systems and in which sense we have interesting new type of flows emerging and what is the role of interfaces. Well, I will talk about defects, and which is more a singularity, the role of singularities in these flows, and then fluid interfaces. Okay, so briefly, what we mean by active systems is just basically we refer to active systems from a physics point of view to systems in which the relevant elements are able to convert energy into mechanical work. And mechanical work may mean stresses or in many cases motion as well. So then it's a question of how motion emerges in these systems where we are not forcing them. And the motivation comes from nature, and I would say the modern approach to these systems from a statistical physics point of view probably goes back to 95 with the work of Bigchek that proposed, the pointer doesn't work here, I'll use the old pointer. We propose a very simple model, which is like a moving icing model to try to understand, or in relation to how to understand collective motion in systems without leadership. And from then, this has evolved a lot because we can have active systems not only at the level of the organisms, but also we can have them inside cells. This is actually the flow of a plant cell, which is caused, you don't see it, but the membrane of this cell is covered by microtubules, and you have molecular motors moving along them, and it's the motion of these motors that generate a flow that is called cytoplasmatic streaming that actually can generate a flow over the whole cell, and that has very significant implications associated to metabolism. And we know how to create them in a lab. These are the collective motion of a large number of colloidal particles that are allowed to move by an instability that was introduced by Quink. And basically, as you can see, they can start moving, rectify the motion, and they can, again, structure themselves in nice patterns. In this case, it seems that they are racing along this channel. I will simply to point out again from a physical point of view what is really relevant conceptually about these systems and what makes them different from usual standard non-equilibrium systems where we put a field or gradient in pressure and generate a flow, is that they are intrinsically out of equilibrium in the absence of any external forcing. This is an old experiment by Galacha et al., where they had bacteria. We heard about bacteria yesterday. Then they are fluorescently labeled to see them. And here there is a set of barriers of this triangular shape. They essentially don't attract. It's like a gas of this bacteria moving around. And when you see is that they naturally self-segregate in half of the box. If this would be an equilibrium gas, all the box should be green, or homogeneously green. So this tells us that the details is that these obstacles have a size comparing to the characteristic run distance of the part of this bacteria. They run and tumble, and then they are kind of like funneled through this channel. But in equilibrium, that shouldn't matter. All that matters in equilibrium is the the particles should be distributed according to the Hamiltonian with Boltzmann. So this is a clear example that we do not have a Boltzmann distribution that we can use as a reference to understand the emergence of collective behavior, which is different from usual non-equilibrium statistical systems where we know that in the absence of a field, system is in equilibrium and we can use it to build perturbation theories, to build our conceptual understanding. I mean, here the reference state, if there is no food, they are dead, then they would be distributed according to Boltzmann distribution, but that's hopeless because that's the non-interesting state. Yeah. So in a way, conceptually, it has required the development of new ways to capture or to describe this collective behavior without having any equilibrium reference. And what is the reference is something that still, if you want, from a fundamental point of view, is still unclear. This leads to significant implications. For example, if instead of being fixed, no, I wanted to go back, sorry. You have now a wheel, which again is not symmetric. I have to go through the moves again, sorry. One more, yes. Yes. Then and here you have the bacteria and this can move. Then again, in equilibrium, this will fluctuate around. But now, in this case, again, because of the same mechanism, if we have an asymmetry and then they can slide asymmetrically without detailed balance, then you can rectify motion. So you put food, you can extract work out of it, out of this wheel, if you like. Okay. So one of the important, when we look at smaller scales, in many cases these agents are in a liquid medium, and therefore it's not just that they move, it's just that they generate flow around it, they generate active flows. The cytoplasmatic streaming of the first transparency was an example, and we know how to create. I will come back now to this particular setup. Again, inside the cell, I was talking that you have these polymeric filaments that contribute to the skeleton of the cell, the microtubules, and then molecular motors can bind, and then by consuming ATP can move along them. That gives rise to active gels. And if we put these gels inside a droplet, they can absorb at the interface and generate active drops. This was shown active emulsions where the motion of the droplets is basically controlled by the stresses that these motors generate on their surfaces. So this is a very lively emulsion as compared to the corresponding passive one in oil water, say. And this can be exploited to generate or control flows at different scales. Actually, what I will be talking about these flows, if I can go to the next slide. No? Yes. So actually, the fact that there are flows and rich spatiotemporal features is quite, I would say, transverse in this active system. So here I show you images. This is from a review where was comparing flows in bacterial suspensions or sperm suspensions. These particles, these colloidal particles I was talking about, that can move around, in this case, through decomposing a chemical. These are Janus self-propelling particles. These are cell monolayers, and these microtubule kinesin suspensions I was mentioning. All of them will give rise to this intricate phenomena where flows are chaotic. And I mean, one of the, say, ways to try to understand them, as we know from inertial turbulence, is to try to look into their spectra, how they behave, how energy is produced and transferred across scales. And that's a way to try to export what we know from dynamical systems in inertial turbulence into what is now active turbulence. So so basically what I will, so let me just go, so these are, let me then finalize this introductory part mentioning, because I will talk now a bit more in detail about these mixtures of microtubules and kinesin and these molecular motors that form structures. I mean, what you see here, these are experiments done in Barcelona, And here, when you see in the color, is the concentration of these microtubules. So if it's black, there are not many, and then these microtubules, because of the activity of these motors there, they tend to bundle, structure them, and also give rise to structures. I mean, here, this is an experimental setup in 2 dimensions of quantity. So it's basically like 2 liquids, and then they manage to absorb these microtubules at a planar interface, and then they look at the effective 2D hydrodynamics of this active mixture, and they manage experimentally to create a core around which these microtubules will organize. And in principle, you could think that if this is a passive nematic, then you could have a star-like structure. The activity makes this structure intrinsically unstable. There is a theory that predicts that there is an intrinsic instability that will favor bending of these structures whenever there are defects. And this is a series of snapshots of this movie where you will see they try to focus now in the experiments, and then you will see how this structure becomes unstable and give rise to, again, a very dynamic motion of these filaments. There are, again, defects here. There are singularities of this is the concentration. I mean, they can also look at the local polarization of these microtubules, these filaments, and actually that allows them to identify defects. And the defects in these nematics typically are -1 or +1/2, -1/2 or +1/2. And in equilibrium, that's there. The nematic field can have singularities that tend to get close to each other and annihilate. So they would decay in time. In this case for these active nematics, that happens. So the singularities with opposite sign will cancel each other, but then now activity allows to generate defects. So typically, the status is that you have these flows with an average density of defects, and also they become quite asymmetric. The -1/2, which are this sort of like triangular shape, because they are relatively symmetric, they are static. The -1/2, they have a local polarity, if you want, a local axis, and then they propel. So you will have propelling defects that will meet the other ones and cancel, and then they are also created. So at the end, you have, again, a very rich state of motion with an average density of defects that characterizes this chaotic flow. So what I will try to go through is to look into these active nematics in these 2D systems that are experimentally achieved. There are also more recent experiments in 3D, and then I will also talk about the defects in 3D. And I would also like to move to, here will be more about chaotic or turbulent flows and the role of these singularities. And the last part is what I would really look into another type of active system related to this active colloids I mentioned, where then there are liquid interfaces that can be stabilized by activity. Then it's the role of activity against surface tension. So basically, as I said, what I will be showing you are numerical studies and our conceptual understanding of essentially a hydrodynamic problem. So this is a compact way to refer to the Navier-Stokes equation with a stress tensor, but now the stress tensor contains not only the viscous fluxes, which would be Navier-Stokes. Now we have a coupling to the nematic order parameter. And so we will have another equation for the nematic order parameter Q, the Q tensor, that is related to the nematicity. And we use the Q tensor. It's a formulation that allows us to also to control the isotropic nematic transition. The equation for the active nematic also contains the convective derivative, corresponding convective derivative. Then there is a relaxation term associated to what is called the molecular field. This molecular field, if you want, conceptually is nothing else than the functional derivative of the free energy that defines the nematic with respect to the order parameter. is the driving thermodynamic force towards equilibrium, if you want. And then beyond these two, because this nematic is a tensor, there is then also a coupling. We have to take into account how this nematic order of matter couples to the symmetric and antisymmetric part of velocity gradients whenever we have extensional or vertical flows. Okay, so this is the equation, the dynamical equation for the nematics. And as I said, everything that has to do with the fact that we have a nematic in equilibrium is controlled by a free energy. So we have the Landau, the Jens free energy term for the nematic that determines this term H. Also, there will be a contribution to the stress that will affect the fluid flow that comes also from this free energy. And that's what's true for a passive in equilibrium nematic. The fact that it's active, the fact that we have the molecular motors that are moving along, is that then they will generate stress. And this is what I call here the active stress. And what we assume is that whenever there is a local ordering of these molecular motors, then, of the polymers, then the motors will be able to exert a stress along it. And this is the simplest form, and that's enough to give a lot of rich behavior. So I will keep this simple phenomenological term. So if you want, everything that has to do with the fact that they have these molecular motors moving and generating a stress, a dipole along the filaments is in this term. If this term is zero, all this is just passive standard nematohydrodynamics. And therefore, an important point is then what is this term generating? If you want at the local level, then this term, if this alpha is positive, then it's called a contractile nematic, and if it's negative, it's an extensile. I think also just in the concept of in the area of bacteria, one can also talk about extensile or contractile bacteria for E. coli or for chlamydomonas, depending on how they generate the stresses in the fluid. So that's a generic way to say whenever I have an active element, it doesn't generate a force, generates a stress because the motion is force-free. And that's like the parameter that characterizes the amplitude of this stress. A minor point, when I was talking about the coupling of the nematic order parameter to the stresses, strictly speaking, for a nematic, and that's also true for a passive, they can align with the stress or they can tumble. This is controlled by a coefficient here. It will appear a bit collaterally. I will not put a lot of emphasis, but that's if you want a generic way to formulate the nematodynamics with activity, and that allows us to understand how activity will affect the hydrodynamics of this liquid. So now, what is known? Sorry. What is? Yeah, sorry. I know I didn't write it down. Sorry. This is the symmetric part of the stress, of the velocity stress, and this is the antisymmetric part. Yeah, thank you. Sorry?
What is feeding the instability?
What is feeding the instability? Is this term. So if I put this term to zero, then I will have, what I will do now is to look what happens in a fluid where I do not force it. Yeah, I do nothing from outside. No external forcing.
But you have the lack of balance.
It's here. All the physics, everything will come through this apparently very innocuous term because it's linear in Q. It enters in the stress. I will take the divergence of this term. So you could say, wow. But the point is that this term, so yeah, that's so you have the free energy. From the free energy, I can derive the stress tensor, the contribution of the elasticity of the nematic to the stress in the fluid in a consistent way. This term cannot be derived from a free energy. And that's the key point. So I can put here whatever, but if I imagine a function that I can think of it as a functional derivative of the f that can give me a stress, at the end is like equilibrium-like, and it will be equilibrium behavior. But this term cannot be expressed as a change of what would be the equilibrium pressure. Okay, now that makes it qualitatively different. Why is this term and not another one that really leads? That's a separate question. But that's from a conceptual point of view, that's the important part. No? That this term, that there are contributions to the stress that cannot be understood as a add-on to what would be the equilibrium pressure of the fluid.
Can you describe the implication? Slide. So deep implication.
Yeah, because this term alone now will make the fluid unstable, will generate a fluid flow that can be self-sustained. In that sense, is qualitatively different from, if I could put this as part of this passive pressure and I do nothing, I know that the system is, this dynamics is relaxational, goes to equilibrium, and equilibrium is a stable state. I need to force it to generate flow, okay? In that sense, it's different, yeah? So the passive one, because I have a pneumatic liquid crystal, if the order parameter, the pneumaticity is not uniform, if I have gradients in the pneumatic field, that in general will lead to pressure that will generate flow. That's what I call here passive. So it's the contribution to the stress in the fluid that comes by distorting my pneumatic in equilibrium. I have the walls, and then I just, if I rotate it, then it will generate certain profile. Yeah, that's passive. While active is this part that I cannot express as coming from a distortion that would be equilibrium-like. Yeah. Okay, so now, what is known with this term, and I will not show it, and that's maybe the way to look at really the fundamental point, is that you take these equations, now you assume that you have a pneumatic that is aligned and consider a bending distortion. Now, what you can show is that that bending distortion is unstable for certain values of this alpha parameter. In that sense, it's qualitatively different because this stabilizes. If alpha is 0 and I put a bending distortion, it will always go back to equilibrium, okay? So what you have here, so basically, and that's known, so typically, it's known that then what controls this instability is coefficient A, that is a ratio between an active length scale, so alpha is this active parameter, K is the, maybe should go back again. So in this free energy term, all this which is homogeneous control the isotropic pneumatic transition. Oh, okay, yes. And then, this is, yeah, and this terms here. And then this term that goes with the gradients, this is the one elastic constant assumption has this constant K. It's the energetic cost of deforming the elasticity associated to the formation of the pneumatic order parameter. The ratio between this energy cost and the this input of pressure through activity defines a length scale, and basically is the ratio between the length scale, this active length scale that is known. So the more active the system is, the smaller LA, and the system size defines a parameter. Above a certain value of this parameter, then it's unstable. Then what you can see is that there is a sequence of instabilities that go from what would be the pneumatic order state towards finally, so these are intermediate stage. We solve the equations. Here it would be relatively stable. There are cases where you have patterns that still are not fixed. So you start seeing a motion, but still, and then at some point it will become unstable. And if you keep on increasing the activity, at some point it will become completely, let me see, yeah, I don't have one, you'll see the movie afterwards, when it becomes unstable. So at some point then these patterns disappear, and then we have a more chaotic state. So people refer to this as active turbulence. Some people don't like to prefer to reserve the name turbulence for inertial turbulence. This is not inertial turbulence. It's just a spatiotemporal motion. And one way to characterize as in turbulence, in classical turbulence, is looking, for example, at the kinetic energy spectrum. And typically, once we are in this chaotic state, what one can see is that there is a regime that is q to the -4 at shorter scales, and then at larger scales, there is a prediction that should go as q to the -1. And this is, I mean, I wrote the Navier-Stokes equation because these systems, I didn't talk about scales, but I was talking about motors and filaments. These typically are micron scales. So these are small scales that happen inside the cell. So because these are small scales and we work with water or sometimes even more viscous fluids, then Reynolds number is small. So there is a way to look into this problem that says, well, let's forget about the Navier-Stokes equation. It's enough to look at Stokes equation. And then with the Stokes equation, and assuming that you have all that matters is you look at the spectrum of the equations that I show you. I mean, there is a q to the -1 dependence at large scales, at small q's. However, I would say this is something that is still controversial. So already understanding the spectrum, it's still not, I don't think it's completely settled. Experimentally, it's very hard to get there. So these are experiments of this setup I was showing you before that basically show typically a plateau. So they don't see that, but that's an interface between these two fluids. So you could wonder, it's a 3D coupling it's not complete evidence. However, there are theories not for this active nematic, but for a fluid where you put a suspension of bacteria, that would be closer to the talk yesterday, that said that actually this, you have a larger scales, whether you have molecular motors or whether you have bacteria, all these objects generate these dipolar stresses, this stress that I was mentioning that is active. And the claim of Scultelli et al. Is that at very large, low Qs, I mean, this is a different notation, there is a tendency to saturate because there is structuring at larger scales of these objects that the theory, the simple hydrodynamic theory here doesn't take into account. So what is the spectrum? How energy is really stored or transferred at different scales? It's something we still do not understand. So if we have a simple hydrodynamic Stokes theory, or we have a more detailed kinetic theory for the coupling of the suspended active objects and the fluid, lead different results. Experiments are not consistent. So I think that's still something that requires a proper understanding of what are all the scales that are involved in these systems. What I want to show you now, this is true in 3D. Yeah? Now I wanted to show, what I will show now is, I will not reply that question. I think that's still an open question. We try to look into, again, with the model that I was showing you for active nematohydrodynamics, what happens if we take a 2D fluid? This is truly 2D now. And what you can see is that if that alpha is positive or negative, or contractile or extensile, I mean, these are just snapshots of velocity, vorticity, or the nematic doesn't, I mean, there are differences in the structure are difficult to really appreciate visually. So again, we look at the spectra. So this is the elastic spectra of the energy, elastic energy, and this is the kinetic energy, essentially is the velocity squared at different wave vectors. And here I show this for alpha positive or negative, for this contractile or extensile. What you can see is in the elastic spectrum, in principle, at high Q, there is a length scale on which energy is pumped into the system. You could think that's not surprising. At the end is this Q active stress that generates energy and will pump it at the characteristic scale, and then it will then sort of move to larger scales. What is different, depending on the character of these stresses, is that here there is a relatively well-defined length scale, while for the extensile one, I mean, this is almost, it can go almost to a decade, so it's much more spread. And you will see that this has an impact into what I will show you later. If we look at the kinetic spectra, then I was saying at large K, there is this Q to the -4 and then Q to the -1. Well, okay, if you're generous, you could say, yeah, maybe. But again, it's difficult. I mean, we went to 2D system sizes that were quite large, and still, it's hard to be able to cover significantly, with significant decades, all the scales. So I think this is still not completely clear, and more, it's mostly here in this case, it's rather going to this constant. So probably is more related to this more recent kinetic theory analysis. And this is something we still need to understand. But what we were surprised, and I wanted to show you now, is that when, in the case of the extensile one, when we started increasing this psi was whether it was tumbling or aligning. So when they align, then we observe cases where the spectrum looked differently. So in the past here, I was showing situations where it tended to level off. For the record, I mean, as I said, we always work at very small Reynolds number at small scale. So we pump up the viscosity, so the Reynolds number on the scales in which we are putting energy is small, but obviously then the system starts spreading. So if I compute the effective Reynolds numbers that I have in the system, they are not necessarily that small. So, and actually there were, like, for example, cases like this. I mean, this is systems that at smaller scales, I'm using the same physical parameters. So the Reynolds number is small, but finally, it evolves into larger structures with a very high Reynolds number. So I'm not changing the Reynolds number. This is the effective Reynolds number on the length scale in which the system evolves. And here you can see, again, these are a measure of the velocity. And you can see that, as I said, in the two cases, this is spatiotemporal chaos, chaotic behavior. But here, structures develop over much larger length scale. So for the extensile, you can have patterns that are very, very large. And this correlates with the fact that then you can have large Reynolds numbers. And now you have a spectra that keeps on increasing at low wave vectors. And this is, in a way, if you want, this is more reminiscent of in 2 dimensions, when we have inertial turbulence, we have an inverse cascade that goes from small scales to large scales. So this is reminiscent of that. But in 2D turbulence, normally, in 2D inertial turbulence, one is forcing the system at large scales. So here we are not forcing the system. Everything comes from the smaller scales where the fluid is Stokesian, where inertia is irrelevant, but somehow it's able to generate the structures that develop at sufficiently larger scales where then inertia becomes different. So this is a multi-scale problem where, again, assuming Stokes is an oversimplification. And I think I have then this movie for this case. So this is just the spectra in this case. And here I show you as an inset the typical kinetic energy as function of time, which keeps on increasing. So we are pumping energy from this alpha Q term at smaller scales into larger scales. And if you, is it doing anything or not? So here you will see a movie of the vorticity. Yeah, now. So this is the vorticity as a function of time. So you can see that this random is changing quite a lot. I mean, it's positive and negative in areas, but you will see that with time, the features starts growing, or you can identify features at larger scales. And eventually, you will see that there are two counter-rotating vortices that becomes of the size of the system size, and somehow that will be the final stage. And that, again, is reminiscent of inertial 2D turbulence, where we can develop these large vertical structures that emerge from, in this case, everything is coming from this pumping of stresses at small scales. So just to finish this part, I don't know how much time I'm having. 50 minutes, okay. So then, I mean, if you want, we characterize the different stresses, the spectra, and when it grows. But I wanted to briefly mention that if we now, so this is just to say that we can have this new scenario for the emergence of inverse cascades for which we still don't have any theoretical understanding. And we move to 3D. And in 3 dimensions, the behavior is quite different because now we don't have these -1/2 and +1/2 defects. Defects are qualitatively different. Now, defects are essentially this, I mean, you can simply see them moving around, but you have typically closed circuits that actually circles. This is in experiments, they manage in 3 dimensions to follow some of these defects. So we develop a method to look into defects. And what we saw is that now what we have is a soup of these defects. So we try to characterize them geometrically. So actually, we could measure what is the radius of gyration as a function of the defect size. So, and here, in some cases, if defects are not very large, they have a more circular structure. So the radius of gyration clearly square scales with the size. And then at some point, we will have a much more intricate, closed defects. And actually, if we look at them statistically, if we look at the probability distribution of these defect sizes, there is here the circular ones that exist at small scales, and then afterwards, what we have is a very wide distribution of defects. It's actually a power law with an exponent 5/2, which actually can be understood in terms of a Fisher exponent. That is the ratio between the dimensionality of the system and the fractal dimension of these objects. And these objects actually have a fractal dimension 2. So this gives us this exponent 5/2 that characterizes this distribution. And the other characteristic of the defects is that we have a very wide distribution of defects that again, this is in a steady state. As I said, in a passive nematic, the defects would decrease with time. Here we have a well-defined distribution because they are being, this intricate closed trajectories will merge, will break up. So it's very dynamic, but statistically give us this distribution. And also what we see is that there is a singular component. There is always one fraction of the defects that are scaled with system size. So if I keep on increasing system size, this will go up. And actually, we attribute this to, it's a topological consequence of having, we are doing this with periodic boundary conditions. So we have the topology of a torus. So you can imagine that we can have defects that can eventually close through the smaller size of the torus, or the other one, that they will not. And along this direction, eventually, there is a possibility, if you want to have a defect that will close over itself, but cannot be reduced, say, if you want, it's not a closed trajectory. And those, so these are the ones that are not closed, sorry, and these ones are the ones that can be closed. So these ones then will give us this component. So we have a separation of like a condensate, because it's always there, of this particular subset of non-wrapping defects, while the rest, which is in number, the majority, but in volume fraction, they are comparable, that gives us this exponent, this power law. So this is just to say that, again, the nature of these defects, when we now go to 3 dimensions, is qualitatively different. Now they don't have a one single topological charge. The topological charge changes along the defect, along each of these defects, but it's a very intricate structure that, again, in passive nematics had not been looked at, because typically this would be a time-dependent phenomenon. Yeah, because they.
Percolation here. Percolation. What is percolation?
No, oh, sorry, no, because percolation in the sense that this exponent 5/2 here is related to other problems. Yeah, exactly. To other geometrical problems. Yeah, exactly. Yes. No, it's just this exponent. You find it in other, there are systems that have nothing to do with this active nematic, where they have also the ability to form this 2D random closed trajectories that also have the same exponent. And it's understood geometrically as a kind of a percolation.
Oh, okay. But there is the plus, there is the...
No. Yeah. So maybe in the last five minutes? Yeah. 8 minutes. Okay. Now I wanted now to, as I said, to change gears, since this is about interfaces. Now I talk more about singularities and how activity is able to sustain these singularities and how they change qualitatively the nature of the flows in these active nematics. I wanted now to forget about nematics, so I go to liquids. This is motivated binary fluids by, again, in biology inside the cell. Now for some time, it has been realized that there are organelles that exist at a finite size without membrane. Traditionally, organelles inside cells have membranes, and membranes are considered to be the way to sustain them. But because we have complex mixtures of polymers and multi-component molecules, in principle, in equilibrium, it's possible to end up sustaining objects, liquid objects of a finite size that will not coarsen, okay? Now, what I want to look at is how activity can also be an important element in sustaining objects, liquid objects of finite size. And I will do that again by looking at a very simple idealized, if you want, system where I consider a binary mixture. So instead of a nematic, I have a binary mixture now. So the free energy is kind of simpler. We will have the cost. We have an order parameter phi, the cost of the gradients. This is associated to surface tension, and the volume, the homogeneous term, can be simply a double well form for this free energy that will lead to the possibility to have a coexistence between two liquid phases. That's a standard free energy model for a binary mixture. And we know that in equilibrium, if I start with this free energy and I go beyond the critical temperature, there will be a macroscopic phase separation between the two immiscible fluids, okay? Now, what I will do now is look at what happens if I consider this binary mixture and I include particles that can self-propel. So the activity, like this Quinker roller, so when I mentioned very quickly about Janus particles, is that these are particles that are suspended in this mixture, and these particles can self-propel. So they are Brownian particles. So if I forget about this first term, I will have the force, the interactions between different colloids or with the mixture, and diffusion. So that's Brownian motion. And then the fact that they are active means that you can think that each particle has like a preferred direction to move, to propel, and then they will have a characteristic velocity and they will move along that direction. This direction, though, will diffuse. So in 2 dimensions, I will show you results in 2 dimensions mostly. In 2 dimensions, this vector is characterized by an angle, and this angle essentially diffuses. Yeah? So if I have this diffusion and this propulsion, that gives me the ratio, gives me a characteristic length, a persistence length. It tells me how far the particle will move along its direction before it just randomizes it. If I divide this length by the particle size, will tell me how much the particle can move on a straight line before forgetting and its direction. And that's what in the community people call Peclet number, is the ratio between these two lengths. So the fact that these are active, it will be encoded in this coefficient, in this term. It's how much it can propel against before random motion will make it forget about the orientation it has. Now, I will not go in the details. I show you now numerical results of a suspension of these particles in a mixture. This mixture is simulated using, it's a hybrid model, so it's like model B. So again, the mixture will have a free energy that I show in the previous transparency. The functional derivative of the functional with respect to the order parameter is the chemical potential. So that's just the usual diffusion. And then there will be a coupling energy that will tell me whether the particles prefer to be in psi +1 or -1. They want to be in one phase or the other. So I make the active particles diffusive in one of the two phases. And here they want to be in the white phase. So white and gray are +1, -1, the two fluids that want phase to phase separate. And what we see typically is that there are cases where these active particles can, they stay in the phase where they are soluble, but they can fight against the tendency of the binary mixture to phase separate. So actually, this is the characteristic length scale of the domain as a function of time. And if the activity is very weak, this number is small, then you will have coarsening until system size. That's macroscopic phase separation, which is what we expect for a binary mixture. But then as we increase the Peclet number, then at some point, what we see is that this size is controlled. Yeah? So we checked that this was reversible. So rather than starting from a random initial condition, I just start now from a completely phase separated system. And then I put the particles and I see this is a small Peclet numbers. And then you will see that they distort the interface, but finally they stay there. But then at larger activity, the active particles are able to dissolve the phase and form this emulsion. This is an active emulsion. So here again, you have fluid interfaces, but here the particles are not surfactant. So the way in which they sustain this emulsion is different from standard equilibrium emulsions. Here is these active particles generate an active pressure that is able to sustain or balance the capillary pressure that tends to pull the particles away. And if you even push the Peclet number, then this size decreases, and at some point it becomes very dynamic. And out of curiosity, if the Peclet number is very large, the particles end up in the phase where they are not soluble in a way. Okay, so I think I'll finish here. So it's, maybe just because I mean I can go in detail. I mean, we have been studying in detail what happens as a function of the parameters with these emulsions, and I simply wanted to finish by saying that these are different type of emulsions, and we can also have active foams, not only active emulsions. That again, in equilibrium, we know that we can have a field theory based on this model B, where the chemical potential derives from the derivative of the free energy function. There are active field theories that add terms that cannot be derived from a free energy phenomenologically, but it's not clear what we don't know, and that those field theories predict also the formation of bubbles, so they can also arrest coarsening. However, it's not so clear. Once we have these particles that I've shown you that interact among themselves, it's not obvious what is the corresponding field theory, because here everything is local, depends only on gradients. But in the case of interacting particles, these theories become non-local. So whether there is a universality field theory to understand what I've shown you or not is something that's still unclear. Concept of self-extension is also unclear, okay? And I think I'll finish here, and thank you for your attention.
You started to talk about universality, like in classical turbulence in fluids, like Pagonabarraga law, those are key features, right? And here we have this material suspensions, we have active gels or synthetic. They're like universality class for all of them, or one individual theory.
I think that on a conceptual point of view, that's something we are working on. I don't think we have a clear idea. I mean, okay, for the first part about
You're talking about theory now.
I mean, when you talk about universality, it's like how we understand conceptually whether we can identify essential, what are the essential components that allow us to gather together all these different examples that I'm showing. I mean, in the case of the turbulence that I talk about for the active pneumatics, I think it's clear, as I said, that there are pieces. No, if you assume that you have Stokes and you decorrelate, then you can understand where the exponents are. But how you derive that from a kinetic theory that allows you to identify the essential ingredients of the two fields, we don't know yet. In this case, as I said, if you make this assumption about locality, so that basically how you break detail balance can be stored or understood in terms of gradients, then I think we know. I mean, there are families, so we depending on what gradients you have here, you can classify different field theories. But in the case of these interacting particles that are non-local, I don't know if that is a sufficiently general scheme or not. We don't know that yet. Yeah, but I think that's a goal that we have, not to understand what could be the essential symmetry ingredients that we have to put in to capture the phenomenology of all these different systems.
Okay.
Thank you. 2 or 3 slides back, I had the impression you have a two-phase system, which is symmetric, so both phases the same content, and then you put in your something like this. You put in your active particles, and then it breaks out this equilibrium state and so on. But you typically don't form like a bicontinuous structure, would you have, but like this ordered arrangement of droplets or something. Is there any explanation why this happens?
Okay, so in general, it's true that what I've shown here is a 50-50. So the binary mixture is symmetric, which means that in equilibrium, you would expect that they would phase separate through bicontinuous structures. And here, clearly, the active particles arrest that and change the topology, because now we have emulsions. We don't have a bicontinuous phase. If we change now the relative fraction of one with respect to the other, there will be cases where we can have, that's what I meant, a foam. So we can have in some cases, configurations where you will have a bicontinuous morphology that then it's arrested by the activity, but it's not symmetric. So the activity also shifts the values where you will have bicontinuous or none, and this is not geometric. We have some ideas, qualitative ideas, as how this extra pressure breaks the symmetry. At the end, you have two phases that are not symmetric. So where you sustain these bicontinuity is also shifted. Yeah.
The last question.
Okay, going very far back to the simplest example, you had a circulating active colloid in a tube, like maybe the third or fourth slide.
Yeah.
Was that numerics or experiment?
Sorry, that was experiment.
And what was the nature of those active particles?
Yeah. So thank you. I didn't explain it, but so these are colloids that are in a polarized medium, and then you apply an electric field. Then if this electric field is large enough, at some point there is an instability. So the particle polarizes and therefore accumulate charge around it, but then that polarized state is unstable and then it can rotate. So basically it's not active in the sense that here you put a field, but the field is homogeneous and generate a hydrodynamic instability that will make the particle start, in this dipole, will start rotating in this electric field, and in the presence of a wall, that rotation leads to translation.
So they're metallic.
They are metallic, or partial metallic. I think Petya, maybe tomorrow, will talk about this system in more detail. So, because I didn't reach there, but you can put those colloids inside droplets, and then you have active droplets. And I don't know, maybe she will talk about this. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.